Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me once again, my good friend, Debbie Romero, certified Alexander Technique instructor. So today's topic is a carry on from the last podcast where we talked about rider position versus rider balance. And one of the things that came up in that podcast, that is a whole podcast into itself, is the topic for this week. Do we move with the horse, or are we supposed to sit still? Which one is it? Because we get both instructions as a rider a lot.
Yes.
And before we dig into this too deep, I had a comment on the YouTube channel, and I wanted to let you guys know, I don't know if I've ever mentioned it, but in the description box below on the YouTube videos and in the description box for the podcasts that are on podcast platforms, I always post in there Debbie's website and my website address. So we're both working professionals. We both work remotely with people online, and happy to meet you, happy to have you make contact with us. And so that information for finding my website or Deb's website is always every podcast, every video is posted in the description box below. So that's the only news announcement. And we got a really great comment on the last video of how helpful that was. So we're going to carry on with some of these. Oh my God, what do we call them?
I don't
Like euphemisms, or it's just these vague descriptions that we all hear for years and years and years in riding instruction.
Well, and it's everywhere too. I mean, even the sit up straight. How long have we heard that even in school or whatever?
Yeah, so I know like that's kind of a personal fingernails on chalkboard phrase for you is sit up straight. And so what do you find? Like what I find is almost all humans instinctively sort of respond to that directive almost in the same way. So when somebody says sit up straight, how do you see people responding to that instruction? And why does it drive crazy?
They usually go into extension, like, shorten their back, their head and neck go back. They hollow their low back. So it becomes a muscular efforting thing. And I did I got a grant to work in a primary school, and we asked the teachers to change the language to sit up soft and tall.
Oh, and did you find the kids responded differently to that?
Yes.
Yeah, so much of it has to do with language, because the same as riders, like especially we're told keep our hands still, keep our legs still. Or sometimes I'll say sit quietly or sit motionlessly. Like there's a lot of instruction that says sit still. And I find the same thing, that the human interpretation, our first interpretation instinctively, is to overly contract all of our muscles.
Yes.
Like to really,
we think that's stillness. It kind of goes back to the last podcast of being in a boat.
right. And even people who are first time on boat or learning the paddleboard or something like that, it's the human instinct that to find instantaneous stability, we just sort of grip and tighten every muscle in the body to make ourselves more stationary. And ironically, that actually is completely counterproductive, because it makes us more unstable than it makes us stable. But there's no overcoming that. It's a universal reaction.
It's bringing that subconscious reactatory kind of thing to consciousness. And just the work I do, even no matter what the language is that comes to you, can you pause and reinterpret that so you don't react to it? But the human instinct is to react and contract.
React and contract. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a good description. I get a good visual image with react and contract.
And then you see the ponytail bobs.
Well, and that is like, why is that? Why do you get, bouncy feet or bobbing heads or hands that the more we tighten our muscles of the arms and hands in order to try to keep our hands still, why do we bounce?
It's that level of tension going against the motion that's underneath us.
Yeah.
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 It's
So if you,
contracting, thinking if I contract and shorten around it, I'll stay on, but the opposite happens.
yeah, like I said last time, you become kind of a projectile. And if you're
Yes.
not becoming a projectile, it's like the tighter we make our muscles, the more our whole skeleton, our whole body is sort of having to cope with all of that force of motion. So we become less stable. We become sort of like bounced around. Like if I use the water analogy again, I think of kind of a little wooden dinghy on a stormy ocean that can be sort of bounced around the waves and maybe gets flipped over, maybe it doesn't. But that sort of jarring effect is what
Yes.
we see when riders get too tight in their muscles.
And yeah, and it really goes down to thinking the postural muscles are that support our posture are closer to our bones. So, and close to our spine. So those are the ones we want to use to create tone and stillness, because these are limbs. If we tighten those, we've lost integrity in our spine.
Absolutely. And now you're getting ahead of me a little bit because it's hard to describe. And so we go, what does that feel like? But your explanation is a more accurate explanation of how to use our muscles to support stillness and stability. And so what I find is after our initial instinctive reaction to try to be still or to stabilize our body on the horse using muscle tension, along comes another instructor who says, no, no, you need to relax everything. You need to move with the horse, right? So talk to me a little bit about moving with the horse. What do you see, or what is even your interpretation of that initially? If somebody told you move with the horse, what would you just sort of do if you didn't know what you know now?
Oh, wow. I don't know if I can go back. That's difficult. So to me, it's you're not in neutral anymore. If you're moving with the horse, you're moving with the horse's momentum
Mm-hmm.
and force, which they, for as long as we've known each other, I've never ridden a completely balanced horse. So that I know
Yeah, yeah, no.
of, at least mine aren't. So to me, or moving with the saddle, moving with the horse, I
The
think
way the
that
way I
creates
see it,
instability.
well, exactly. That's what I was just going to say. The way I see it as an observer is some people even gyrate in the saddle,
Oh,
but I see a lot of like skeletal movement where I
good
just
point.
see a lot of, you may as well be kind of a rag doll on the back of a horse. There's just all of this movement in the rider's body, putting effort into trying to move with the horse, or not using enough muscle tone for our own stability. When you watch a rider like that, you see everything moving,
Mm,
right? And so if we put effort into moving with the horse, we're basically following the horse's pattern of movement. Whether it's balanced or unbalanced,
right.
we're going with the flow. And from a physics perspective, if we really look at how the weight and mass of the rider is interacting with the forces of motion generated by the horse, it's like if you go with the sort of the path of least resistance on an unbalanced horse might be to sort of push your body forward to the left. And
Mm,
so if you're moving with the horse, you're adding your weight and mass to the problem of the horse's imbalance. So if I
yes.
add my weight to that sort of direction, like let's say a horse tends to overload the left front leg, well, then the back is going to sort of push me from the right hind. The barrel and the hindquarter are going to kind of push me a bit forward towards that left front foot. So if I'm moving with the horse, then my weight is actually adding to the problem that the horse is already struggling with and not helping it. So I actually, by moving with the horse without being without further detail about that or being educated how to do that, the easiest interpretation is to just let the horse throw my body forward to the left.
Mm,
Because then I'm moving with whatever movement the horse is, the forces that are coming into my body. I'm just letting it go where it wants to go.
right.
And so if you imagine a horse is already overloading, say, the left front leg, maybe you have a pancake foot on that hoof,
Ah,
right? Or you have lameness issues on that hoof, or tight shoulder on that hoof, arthritis in that leg, or tight shoulder on that leg. Adding my weight into the equation every single ride is not going to help relieve all of those concussive forces that the horse is already kind of generating internally just from a dysfunctional use of the body. And
yeah. And
so
what keeps coming up for me, the other questions I always get are my horse, my saddle is always to the left.
yeah, and that's
Yeah.
exactly what I'm describing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the saddle keeps going off to the left, then the forces of the horse's motion are pushing the saddle that way, or off to the right.
Mhm.
And if we're moving with the horse, we're most likely going to go with that saddle with the
Yes.
horse's dysfunctional forces, and we're going to add to it with our own weight and mass. Right. And we can do that and still feel straight. That's the power of the human brain, because we can normalize anything. Right.
Well,
So
yeah, it's like I think I've described like putting on different shoes. You know, you get a total kinesthetic change of awareness when you put on a different set of shoes.
and have to adapt your balance, you mean?
Yeah, and we don't think about that when we're riding, that we have a habitual way that we
Oh,
ride.
that we're carrying up into the saddle.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes. And the other thing I see a lot with move with the horse is that the rider lacks tone, lacks muscle tone. And so if I look at those riders and I kind of look down the skull, the spine, the pelvis, and the core, where we're, really meant to be stable. So if you look at someone again on a boat, they're not moving with every wave, right? Because as soon as we sort of excessively move our axial skeleton, which is our skull, spine, rib cage, and I always include the pelvis, as soon as we're moving that a lot, we're generating force with every motion. So if our bones are sort of moving around a lot, that's generating forces, left, right, front, back, up, down, that not only do we have to cope with, but the horse's back has to cope with, right? Or the horse is coping with an unstable rider in a cart, same thing. So moving with the horse, nobody talks about core stability or axial skeletal stability. And so it turns into this sort of wiggly, noodly midline of the rider. And And I think we reviewed that paper. I know I have that research paper on the inherent stability of the horse's thoracolumbar spine.
Mhm.
And part of the reason we can ride horses is because the horse innately has very little range of motion through the thorax and lumbar, that whole back, the thoracolumbar spine, doesn't have a huge range of motion and is meant to be very, very stable. So when horses authentically lift the back, we don't get a lot of forces of motion. The
No.
correct use of the horse's back reduces the forces that we feel. So in reverse, if we're kind of wiggling and moving all over the place, thinking it feels good to us because we don't feel any forces. We don't have to resist anything the horse is throwing at us,
Good point.
right? So people
Mhm.
love it because we're just sort of rolling along and there's no effort in that at all. It's kind of effortless because you're just letting the horse take you where you want to go. But as our body moves and we're increasing force because we're in motion when we move with the horses have to actually contract their back muscles against all those forces that we're generating by moving our body around. Because particularly our axial skeleton and our core directly affects the horse's back and can
Yes.
destabilize their thoracolumbar spine, which doesn't have a big range of motion anyways. So the more we're wiggling around up there between our seat bones and our head, the more forces we're generating that the horse has to cope with. And just like us, the instinctual response for the horse to find stability is to over tighten the muscles,
Yes.
right? So it becomes kind of this downward cycle. Unstable rider, horse has to really tighten the neck and the back to cope with that instability or those unstable forces that are being generated by the rider. And then we wonder why the horse can't perform.
Or would you also agree that usually it comes out in the kinematics of the legs?
So yeah, kinematics just means the geometric flight path of the
Yeah,
legs.
I mean, we start seeing maybe lamenesses or hock problems or whatever. The
Yeah,
loading the
and
front
we've talked.
legs differently, but it's really coming from the back. It's the legs are just showing what's coming from the back.
Yeah, so whether it's human or equine,
Mhm.
and we've talked about this before in podcasts, if the axial skeleton, which whether it's horse or human, is the skull, the spine, the rib cage, and I always include the pelvis for horses and riders, although technically the pelvis isn't included.
Anatomically, they don't, that's not how they say it, but that's okay.
Yes, but still, even if we take the pelvis out of it, the skull, spine, and rib cage is meant to be the central axis of the body. That's why it's called the axial part of the skeleton. Then we have the appendicular part of the skeleton, which are the limbs. And whether it's horse or human, if the axial skeleton becomes unstable, then the appendicular skeleton has to kick in for stability. So people do it.
Exactly.
So that's where, and we'll have to do a couple more podcasts on all this riding instruction, but it's like when people say, keep your hands still, keep your legs still. If the axial skeleton is not stable, that's impossible.
Impossible.
It's impossible. There is no amount of willing yourself.
And what is stillness anyway? What does that mean? To me, it doesn't mean stillness. To me, what was the word we used in our last podcast? Fluid. It has to be have fluidity to it. It's not lock your muscles and hold on for dear life.
So, and this gets to the heart of how I've learned to explain it over the years, because the instructor from the ground who's telling the rider to sit quietly or to be more still is not wrong,
No.
but it's not enough information. And a different instructor who's saying, move with the horse and relax and be more supple is also not wrong. What's complicated is the tensegrity of how our body works,
Right.
right? So more specifically, and I don't know that many riders have ever even considered it, but we can in our brains imagine a separation between our skeletal body and our soft tissues. So between our bones, we can sense the bones apart from, or even imagine it, apart from all the muscle, tendon, ligament, and fascia. So I would put, joints in the category of skeletal or bones, and then tendon, ligament, muscle use, and all of fascia, all of our soft tissue is the other half of our body. And so what I tell people is your bones are meant to be the still part. But in order to keep your bones still or quiet, you have to feel like you're moving. And I don't know how to explain this. I've never seen research on it, but there's something that happens in our brain that our sense of motion is linked to internal weight shifts and muscle tone changes. Like that gives us the sense of moving.
I wonder if it has to do with a study that Tim Cacciatore did on having the center of mass over your feet.
Yes. So if you take your center of mass, which should always be directly over your feet and vertical to gravity. That's
Yeah, because the
this.
ground reaction force, I don't think people take that into account, that there is
Right,
actually a force that comes up against how much we force down.
right,
So,
right. So gravity is a constant force. And if we think of the middle of our three-dimensional body, our center of mass, or there's another term to talk about called point of balance. It's a fluctuating center of instant center of rotation, right? That's really what has to stay vertical to gravity. So that's why we can ride in a 2-point or racing position where we're almost horizontal. Our spine is
right,
horizontal to the ground, but our center is still vertical,
right.
right? So that stillness, whether we're talking about that imaginary center of mass remaining still and vertical, or our axial skeleton remaining quiet and immobile. The tricky part is internally, we have to constantly change and adapt muscle tone and internal weight shifts in order to keep the skeleton quiet when we're coping with forces of motion.
I think you hit the nail on the head that it is not in, it's not external. It can't be arms and legs. It's a very internal stillness or flow level of tone that you have to really dig deep to find. And it takes a while to figure that out.
Yeah. And if, like, you guys can try this in the next ride, I'll have riders imagine themselves as a hollowing skeleton. So I can include the arms and legs,
Okay.
but the main focus is on the axial skeleton, the alignment of especially if you're in a long stirrup, upright standing position, like a dressage rider, Western rider, trail rider, then you can really imagine standing on the ground over the horse, and you can find that internal vertical alignment through the axial skeleton and your center of mass, vertical to gravity. And so once the horse starts moving, what we have to do is our brain feels like we're moving all the time. And this is why I like the sea leg analogy, because on a boat, you never feel like you're standing still. You're always making minute muscle tone changes and weight shifts based on the forces of the currents or the waves or the changes in the water. So once the horse starts moving, in our brains, we feel like we're moving all the time. That's why
Yeah.
that instruction, move with the horse, is not entirely wrong, because that's what it feels like. So a
Right.
talented rider might say, well, this is what it feels like to me. So I'm going to tell people move with the horse because that's what they feel like they're doing. Right. But when we do that in order to keep our center of mass or our axial skeleton stable and not moving, then the appearance is that we are still.
Yes.
So the external
Mind
appearance,
blowing.
I know. Ah, yeah.
What?
And even the more I can bring a rider's focus to either that center of mass point of balance, remaining quiet and vertical to gravity, or the axial skeleton. And that's why I always include the pelvis, because when we
Right.
ride, our pelvis, our seat bones are receiving the most amount of force, right? So if we don't include that pelvis in the axial skeleton, then people, like you say, kind of attach the pelvis to the legs.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work quite as well.
No.
So imagining ourselves like just a skeleton and finding the stillness within our skeleton means every single piece of soft tissue in our body and the mobility of our joints is what helps us adapt. So we're constantly adapting to every little change in the forces of motion. And people who kind of just get their sea legs or people who are naturally talented riders, that's exactly what they do. But I don't know that they're aware of what they do. And it would be very hard to describe.
Yeah, what is some language I use around it? Ride with your joints, make sure all your joints are open and available. I'll use that. Yeah,
And
that's the biggest one.
the joints are the natural shock absorbers for the
Yes,
skeleton.
I think people don't
And
understand that. Yeah.
so when we try to be still or hang on by gripping and overusing our soft tissue to try to cling onto or be still, we lock the joints. And that's
Exactly.
why you get that catapulting effect or that, kind of boingy
The
head,
the
head or
ponytail
feet,
bob.
feet or hands.
Yeah,
Right?
it goes somewhere.
Yeah, it has to go somewhere because
Yeah.
when you're locking the joints, it's like bad shock absorbers in your car. Your car goes bong, 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 bong because the shock absorbers are not doing their job.
Yeah, I always like the image of a jockey because talk about somebody that's using all their joints.
Yes.
And their spine is completely straight.
Yes,
And neutral,
absolutely.
but their elbows and their knees and their ankles and their hips are just working their butts off.
And that is a great example because I tell people all the time, just Google some racing videos, right?
Yes.
And if you look at a racing jockey from sort of a distance, they look like these still little tiny peas that float, like just sort of this from far away, they look completely still on the backs of these galloping horses. And then if you find another video where there's a close up of a jockey, you see those arms are reaching forward, right? So they're using the full range of motion through their shoulder, elbow, wrist joints. And then their head, spine, and pelvis are really pretty stable and
It's beautiful.
almost horizontal to the ground.
Yes.
And right in the middle of that jockey, you will see that the center of mass will be vertical to the ground and probably right over their feet.
Yep.
So even with the legs folded, because when you ride jockey length, the only leg contact you have is your ankles. I mean,
Yep.
that's it. If your ankles touch, that's it. And you can watch their hip joint, knee joint, ankle joints, flexing and extending, flexing and extending. And that's how they're absorbing. Because in the gallop, you have a lot of upward force in the horse's motion, but you also have this incredible sort of accordion stretching of the horse's body front to back. So there's this big range of motion when a horse is galloping, that are creating these long front to back motion, forces of motion, and really strong up and down motion.
Yep.
And so watching a jockey up close, when you look far away, they look still. When you look at
Yep.
them up close, only the axial skeleton and the point of balance or the center of mass are still.
Right.
And all the joints are moving. Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean,
I
it's
so
such a great
appreciate
example.
that, because that to me is what every writer should be writing, like, no matter what the discipline. That's a quiet seat to me.
It is a quiet seat because it's a quiet center.
Yeah, and but it's fluid. It's not static. It's not contracted. It's just open and available. All the joints are working.
Exactly. And within all that mobility of the joints and adaptation of soft tissue and weight changes,
Right.
because that racehorse is going to swap leads every turn, right? So they'll be on the outside lead down the straightaway, inside lead on the turns. And that's a lot of force, right?
Yes.
And it's going to shift a little left to right. So it's a good example of watching a really good professional jockey or even jump riders who are going over these massive jumps. You'll see the same thing. You'll see really good use of the arm and leg joints and kind of a stillness through the head, spine, pelvis, and a stillness with a vertical alignment. If you imagine the center of mass sort of like a softball in the middle of the horse of the body, kind of around the belly button, somewhere in there. That part of that rider is very quiet.
Yes.
But the arms and legs, they're using the joint mobility to keep. That's what the appendicular skeleton is for, is to absorb forces of movement and increase range of motion.
Yeah, and the other visual is the tightrope walker. If you're talking about using the arms and legs to help the center of mass be where it needs to be. And that's the
Yes.
same thing that's going on with the jockey. I mean, all of that movement is to keep the quietness in the head, neck, back, and pelvis.
Right. Absolutely. And it's good to get an eye, because what we'll see is a really good rider looks quiet. There's a lack of visual mobility. Like it appears like the middle, especially the axial skeleton, isn't moving at all.
Right.
But what it feels like is that you're moving all the time.
Yes, there's always these little nuances going on to maintain the stability.
Yeah, and it's the same if we get on a paddleboard or a boat. We can't lock our skeleton. But if we move our skeleton too much, we feel very unstable.
Right.
If we don't use our joints, we can become very unstable and catapulted. If we over tighten our muscles, and it's very hard to describe. So people will ask me a lot in riding lessons, do I use this muscle or that muscle? Do I do this? Do I do that? And I go, I have no idea, because it happens too fast.
Yep.
So we can only focus on one to three things at a time. Like that's like maximum capacity for the human brain.
Get the sticky
And I
note
go,
after 3 for me.
I can only do one, really. So if I'm focusing, like if I'm in a half seat or 2-point or a racing position, I might focus just on my center of mass. If I'm doing dressage or trail riding or Western riding, then I might focus on my whole axial skeleton being vertical to gravity. But what's amazing is our bodies, if we focus our brain on stillness of the axial skeleton and soft mobility through our joints, everybody finds that blend of tone, tension, suppleness, and adaptation through the soft tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point of the muscle use, is to support the stability of the skeleton. Right.
Yes.
But what I see a lot in instruction is the move with the horse, the whole skeleton and all the muscles are moving. Everything's moving.
It's kind of like, I think of, it's the American way of, oh, well, if one aspirin is good for you, I'll take 4. You know, it's like, I'll just create all this movement then.
Yeah. Yes. So I look like, because I'm going to really try,
I'm
right?
going to try. Yeah.
I'm going to
That's what
try harder and harder to move with my horse. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So if we do nothing, the horse will move us,
Yes.
right? We don't even, so you can even tell the difference between riders who have really, it's been drummed into their head to move with the horse. Those are the riders that are putting effort into moving their body,
Good point.
following the horse's movement. And what I see is the timing is off. Like it just
Ah.
grates me because the rider is always behind the horse. And so there's this little, like, there's this little space in there where the horse and rider are so out of sync. I
You
find
just
it,
want to say, catch up, catch up, catch up.
yeah. And so if we're trying to move with the horse, we're always behind the motion.
Yeah, I agree.
No way we can get our body to move exactly at the same speed of the horse when we consciously create movement in our body. And then like, so that just visually is like looking at static. Do you know what I mean? There's just too much going on. And then if I look at a rider who's moving with the horse a little bit better, they're not trying to move their body, but they're not resisting any movement of their body. That rider is in time with the movement of the horse. But to me, it still looks like the rider's all over the place. And that rider who's all over the place is generating a boatload of forces in a multitude of directions that the horse underneath that rider is having to cope with this wiggly, squiggly, like cacophony of forces. And so, of course, they tighten their back, right? And even drop their back because it's just overwhelming.
It's too much. Yeah.
And I'll tell people, either like when I was a kid, we had a swimming pool and we played chicken fights all the time where somebody has an adult on their shoulders. And I go, if you've ever done that, that person who's up on the shoulders is usually the smaller person of the pair.
Right. That would be
But
me.
I was always, up on somebody's shoulders. And I learned to be quiet up there, or the shoulders I were sitting on kind of went underwater. Right.
Yep.
So it was like, oh, I could cause my person to fall over if I move too much. And even if we've never played, chicken fights in a swimming pool, even carrying a small child, I go, oh, a squirmy small child. It makes me laugh. Like if the kid, or my cats do this. I have one cat named Mercury because he never sits still, right? Never. He's always moving, always in motion. And if you try to pick him up, he's like wiggling and squiggling. And I find myself tightening just against all that wiggle, trying to either hang on to him or I just give up and let him, jump and go. So that's the only thing where we experience the perspective of the horse.
Right.
Is if we're carrying somebody on our back or shoulders and they're wiggling and moving all over the place, we realize how much more effort it is for us to just move. And we might find ourselves tightening, excessively tightening over and over just to find stability with all those wiggly forces. So when we try to move with the horse, or we just allow the horse to sort of move our bones all over the place, that's what it feels like to the horse. We feel like a squirmy toddler. Sorry.
It's not like we take our toddlers when they're doing that and hang them out here and say, okay, go ahead, do it.
Right.
We tend to pull them close, get it close to our center of mass.
Oh, yeah. So
if that makes any sense, you pull it closer to you. I don't know how to explain that. I think it's to get that's the instinctual thing to get it closer to your center of mass so it's more manageable.
And I would say it's where we have more power.
Oh yeah, I
So,
agree.
so again, if we take our squirmy toddler and we have to pick them up, yeah,
Yeah,
we're not going to stick our arms straight out and try to hold our hands still, which is
no,
what we do when we ride,
exactly.
right? And holding a toddler at the end of your arms lengthened could be as heavy as a horse.
Or
Absolutely.
I use the analogy of a 5-gallon water bucket. You're going to want to get that as close to your center of mass as possible to manage it,
Yes,
not
because
hold it out here in front of you and try to carry it.
right. And that's where we have our power and our strength is along our axial skeleton.
Yes.
So can you say again what you said early on about the layers of muscle and the muscle we're really using to create skeletal stability?
So what I've found in my 20 some years of practice is that the postural muscles that affect our posture are closest to the bones and especially to our spine, because housing of the central nervous system through the spinal cord is the most advanced form of what do I want to call it, of stability that we need. Because when that's not working properly, that sends a signal to the brain, fear of falling, it's not right. And that's where we see those behavioral things come up with the horses. That's the central nervous system sending out a warning saying, we're not okay here.
Right. And
And
when that happens to a human, we have crutches, we have wheelchairs, we have walking canes, we have walkers, we have
yeah,
things that can help us stabilize. And the
so
only,
that's the visual of, if you think of the worst case scenario as somebody in a walker, because they're using their arms and legs with muscular efforting to stabilize the spine. And that's where the central nervous system sends the message, we're going to fall. The fear of falling comes up, and then the fall usually does happen at some point.
yeah, because you're not utilizing the muscles that really are supporting skeletal stability, especially axial stability.
The
So,
axial stability is the most important. The extremities are not postural muscles. So the outside layers of muscles that the rectus abdominis, that, you know, and the six pack that we see on these guys, those are not postural muscles whatsoever.
okay, so I'm dying to ask you because I know you taught anatomy. Let's take, and you mentioned rectus abdominis, the six pack. So if we just go from sort of that outer muscle, is that layer 1 or layer 4?
I'm going to say I haven't looked at it in a while. It's more layer 1. You got
Okay.
your rectus abdominis on the top.
And then what's underneath that? What
You've
would be
got
the
your
next
obliques.
layer?
You've
Your
got a couple of sets of obliques. One that I say goes in like your pockets, and then another one that goes opposite of your pockets,
so
internal and
almost like
external obliques.
an X across.
Yeah, and the body is like that everywhere. We've got oblique muscles everywhere for support. And then you've got your transverse abdominis, which is a huge, deep.
So are we on layer 3 now?
1, 2, 3, 3, 4.
So layer 3 would be the, what did you say, transverse?
There's rectus abdominis, external obliques, internal obliques.
Internal obliques. Okay.
Then the transverse abdominis, which is the huge sheet muscle that just goes across the whole front. And that's probably what I would call the deepest abdominal muscle, but I even take it down to like Kegel exercises.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that within itself is also another layer of core muscles, sphincter muscles, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, or the psoas muscle. And
the psoas is not supposed to be a postural muscle, but unfortunately, that's a whole nother podcast. But that is unfortunately what we've been using since we're going through this era of sitting at desks that we use to stabilize the pelvis.
we will do a whole podcast on the psoas muscle because it is
We
part
probably
of
should.
the rider vocabulary. It gets
Yeah.
talked about a lot, the psoas muscle. And the same with core, what we call our core.
Yeah, we can
So
do that. Yeah.
if we look at, like, I like that you mentioned rectus abdominis. That's the outer layer of the abdominal muscle. And then the next layer in is sort of that, like, I'm picturing it as sort of like an X of oblique muscles.
And a lot of anatomy books show it as X's.
And then behind that is, what did you call it?
It's the transverse abdominis.
Transverse abdominis. So transverse, is it going left to right?
Yes.
Okay. And then all the way back behind that is basically the big fourth layer of muscle, which is, what did you call it again?
Are you talking about when you get down to the
The
Kegel
deepest,
exercises or the
no,
sphincters?
the deepest layer of the abdominal muscle that's
It's the
closest to the
transverse
bone.
abdominis.
Oh, it is the transverse abdominis. Okay. And that's basically what holds our viscera.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of our vital organs is the viscera, keeps our guts in place.
Yeah. It's the first thing they cut when they do a C-section.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So that would be more like what I see when riders are told to engage their core. I see a lot of belly buttons sucking in. You know what I mean? Rather than it's, if we're thinking of quieting our skeleton, I see riders find just intuitively by focusing on stability, because now we're talking lower thoracic and entire lumbar and pelvic stability for the human. If we're talking about the abdominal muscles in layers, those abdominal muscles in layers are going to be supporting the thoracic portion of the spine, part of it, and all of the lumbar portion of the spine, and supporting the stability of the pelvis. And so in order to get into that deeper layer, we have to kind of bring our minds into that axial stability, the stability of the axial skeleton. And what I see is people feel gently engaged. It's
That's a
not an
good way to put it.
effort,
Yeah.
but they feel
That's
like,
a really, it's such a, I don't know how to explain it. Gently engaged. It's very subtle, but it's very powerful.
people feel that they've activated a muscle. Like there's a sense of muscle activity or engagement, but it's so deep, it's not what we tend to think of when we flex our outer muscles.
That's a good point. And like you mentioned before, you can't see it. It's not a visual. You see stillness, but you don't see muscular effort.
Yes. Yes, because the stillness is the skeletal stillness with joint mobility to act as shock absorbers. So our muscular use and support, and that's why they say when you ride, you find muscles you never knew you had.
That's a good point.
People say that all the time, or they're sore in places that they didn't even know they had muscles. And I think it's because we're straddling a lot of force of motion.
Yes.
And we're having to find access to those fourth layers of muscle, the ones that support our axial stability and our skeletal stability while we're straddling a big moving force, big force of nature. And so, of course, we're going to find muscles that really help our posture and our use off the horse.
Yes.
But on the horse, we will never ride well until we figure out how to sort of gently activate those deeper muscles that support the skeletal stability. So anything you want to add? Because I think it's a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah, the only thing that's coming to mind for me is to not think of the ab muscles or the core muscles, whatever word you use, as being in the front. I mean, those muscles wrap all the way around to the back. So thinking more that we are a cylinder and not just linear, the front of us, that those
Mm.
muscles go all the way around, like you said, to the lumbar. They attach to the ribs and they come around with a big sheet of fascia in the back. So it's all the way around. It's not just in the front.
Yeah, and because the emphasis has really come strongly onto our core, I think people forget that some of the strongest muscle closer to the bone, like you mentioned, are right along the vertebra,
The
up and down the,
multifidus and the rotatories are the most influential on spinal rotation, and I'm sure they are in the horse too.
yes,
Yeah. So
absolutely. And that's why if we're riding a horse that's hard to ride, that's shaking us all over, that speaks to a horse's lack of strength in that fourth layer of muscle closest to the bone. And so they're gripping with their front legs, which are their arms, their hind legs, and with their neck, head
yep.
and neck, is compensating for a lack of axial skeleton stability. And so if we move with the horse, with our skeleton, we actually create more contraction in the outer layer of muscles for the horse than the deeper fourth layer of muscles. Right? So, do we move with the horse? The answer is yes, but very specifically, we adapt body weight and muscle tone in order to keep our skeleton still. So, are we still? Yes, but our brain will tell us we're moving all the time because
Yeah.
we're shifting weight and changing tone. And so that's why our brain says we're moving. And we sometimes have to see a video of ourselves to see how quiet we look.
That's a good point. Video or pictures have a lot to say.
Yeah, move your microphone up. I think it came down a little bit. You're getting quieter.
I'm
Thank you.
getting quieter, not
Oh, there you
me.
are. Now you're back. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. And it's, it's a thing in the horse business that when people say things, we have to think, number one, it's not that simple. Number two, it's got some truth to it. You couldn't really say it's wrong, but that doesn't mean it's right. And
I
our
agree.
number three, our interpretation
Yes.
instinctively is usually not the right one. So, like the human instinct as a natural predator and the horse instinct as a natural prey animal don't naturally get along well with each other.
Right.
So while we're asking our horse to overcome instinct, we have to overcome our instincts as well in order to have a true partnership with our horse. And one of them is to look at from the horse's perspective, how our weight and mass straddling their thoracolumbar spine is affecting their ability to perform, right? Take away the saddle and the bit and the
Yep.
maneuver and what we're doing. We are just weight and mass straddling the spine and rib cage of a horse, and we have an effect by how we use our body is going to either absorb forces, resist forces of imbalance, which is how you balance a horse, or go with the forces, adding more weight and mass to the horse's issues, or even generate force.
Good point.
Generate excessive force that the horse is struggling against all the time. So how we use ourselves, I tell people, I go, it's not neutral. It is never neutral. It is going to have either an effect that helps the horse become better organized, or it's going to affect the horse to become more disorganized.
Mhm.
But how we ride is never neutral.
Good point.
Yeah, unless even a little kid, it's like even a little kid, I go, there's still a weight and mass. And we talked about last time, weight and mass has a force impact that is greater than the actual weight of the body. When you put,
Exactly.
force and when you put weight and mass in motion, you have impact force. So even a little kid on a pony has more impact force than the body weight itself.
Right.
Yes. which is why we can ride horses.
Exactly.
1,000-pound animals. So let's wrap it up there, I guess. And thank you guys for joining us for another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast. We hope you like, share, subscribe, comment. And like I said at the beginning, contact information for Deb or myself is always listed in the description box with the podcast or the video on YouTube. Okay, thanks everybody, and we'll see you later.
Bye.